So congratulations for finding the meeting room. That's a big challenge, coming all the way from the other building and passing through our second building. So congratulations for finding the meeting room. I'd like to welcome all of you this afternoon to this panel on socially inclusive AI. My name is Doreen Bogdan, and I'm the Chief of Strategic Planning and Membership here at the ITU. The central promise of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is about leaving no one behind. And if AI is to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, which of course is the theme for this summit, it will have to benefit all, with no exceptions. Socially inclusive AI is not an option, it's a must. And during this panel this afternoon, we will look at how we can be inclusive in the opportunities that AI has to offer. We will also look at how we can be inclusive in the creation of AI, and that's something that was just touched upon in the previous plenary session. And this means to us, in particular in the ITU, first and foremost, that we need to bridge the global digital divide. And as our Secretary General mentioned this morning, there's still some 3.9 billion people that are not connected to the internet. So there's lots of gaps out there. There's the gaps amongst those connected and not connected, but there are also gaps that are based on race, on gender, on sexual, political, cultural orientations, also on economic inequalities, or even access to ICTs for persons with disabilities. And we need to make sure that the implementation of AI does not exacerbate existing inequalities. And as we turn to the development of the AI side, Kate Crawford, a Microsoft researcher, said that AI will reflect the value of its creators, and that new technologies, like all technologies before, are influenced by the people who build them. So how can we avoid exacerbating social bias and inequalities? And in particular, we're going to be zooming in on SDG 10, which is reducing or getting rid of completely inequalities. Those responsible for building AI need to be representative of the population that they are intending to serve. And our panel this afternoon will let us know how they are each taking steps to address these issues, as well as how they are taking steps to address the critical issue of the lack of talent and skills in this area. There's a real talent gap that we need to also be addressing. We're also going to be looking in our panel at issues around accountability and transparency as two key components of ensuring inclusiveness. Of course, the principles of non-discrimination, transparency, and accountability need to be built into the operation of AI so that automated decision-making processes are transparent and accountable for the analyses and the decisions that they deliver. And also at the core of this discussion is the issue of data. There are calls for the democratization of AI regarding access to data, transparency in who owns the data, harmonizing data sets, and how that data should be used for the benefit of humanity. And with that, I'd like to introduce our stellar panel here this afternoon. I'm going to introduce them first by name and then come back and say a few words more about them before I hand over to them for their first question. So we have Cathy Cobey from EY. We have Saška Mojsilović from IBM Research. Welcome. We have Eleanor Pauwels from the United Nations University. We also have Rebeca Moreno Jimenez from UNHCR, just across the street. And we also have Sharada Mohanty from EPFL. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. So we're going to hear first from Cathy. We will go through each of our panelists with a question. They'll take about 5 minutes. Then we will turn over to you here in the room in Geneva. We will also turn to our remote moderator and see if there's any questions coming in from those around the world that are following our discussion. So Cathy, first over to you. So Cathy is a partner in EY. She heads up the global team that is considering ethical and control implications of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. She has leveraged her unique background as CPA, as well as technology risk advisor. And she's been involved with EY's climate change work as well as sustainability work, looking at kind of the full spectrum, as I understand, of technological and societal implications around intelligent automation development. Cathy, maybe you could share with us what diversity means to you. We know it means different things to different people. As a woman in tech, what does diversity mean to you?
Yeah, it's a really good point that diversity does mean a lot of different things. Like certainly I think about diversity from a gender perspective. I know back in November, the World Economic Forum released their latest gender equity report, and it was discouraging to see that they had increased the number of years it will take until we have gender equity from 170 years to 217, and I think a lot of people have represented that as moving backwards. I tend to think of it maybe being that as we got better data, we're now better understanding the depth of the problem. And I think that there is quite a breadth of issues that are the root cause of the inequality that have to also be addressed. To tell you a little story, I became aware a couple of weeks ago of an all-girls robotics team called the Afghan Dreamers. They're a girl group of 7 from Afghanistan that overcame a ton of challenges over the last couple of years in order to be able to compete at the first Robotics World Championship in Detroit last month. And as I was digging into their story, I was amazed to find out that from January to the beginning of April, they had actually been just down the street from my home. They'd been invited by a girls' school in Oakville, Canada, to come and study and work with them. And as I started to reflect upon the different experiences that those 2 girl groups came to their particular positions, like the girls in Canada had supportive parents, they had robotics camps, they had robotics funding, where the girls in Afghanistan had to fight everything. Their parents were not understanding why they were interested, were not supportive. They didn't have any kind of science or tech programs. They didn't have money for equipment, and yet they all came to the same spot, to that one place in Detroit. And as they now go back to Afghanistan, they have no post-secondary STEM school. Now there is an organization that is working, Ada.ai, to try to raise funds for this, but it's just, there's so many systemic barriers in their way in order to make it into a STEM career. And I think that is 7 girls out of over 2,000 that originally applied to the program that actually got to have that kind of experience. And so how can we try to address that kind of systemic inequality where that whole group of girls is so limited in their accessibility? They talked about how they had arranged to go to some local scientific institution, and the male scientists actually wouldn't allow them to use the equipment. They felt that the girls could not use that time of technical equipment and would break it. And so we need to be thinking about how we address those more systemic problems. I have 2 daughters, they're age 20. And the other thing I think we need to realize is that, being my career and interest area, I really tried to push them into STEM. I was, trying to get them involved in that area, thinking it's the future. But they really had different interests. One wants to do law and justice, the other film production. And so I've now started to talk to them about what the future is going to look like within their areas of interest, and recognizing that they can have still a very important voice and perspective in the involvement or the evolution of technology in their chosen paths. And I think as we think about needing to bring more diversity to the development table, we need to recognize it doesn't always have to come from a STEM background. So I'm actually an accountant by background. And so I see that I bring a diversity to the table, even though I consider myself a woman in tech, because I come to the table with perspective of accountability, of risk, of how to build in controls. And so we have a whole number of women that are employed in different areas, have different perspectives that can come to the table today, even if they don't have that formal STEM background. I was self-taught, and others can be self-taught as well to be able to have at least a meaningful voice in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that. And I think that's a really good point about you don't have to come from a STEM background. I think that's often miscommunicated in the ICT industry, that you have to have a STEM degree in order to excel in that space. So thanks for sharing that. And also about your daughters. I have 2 daughters and have been trying to push them into the STEM field as well. Hasn't entirely worked out. We could talk about that later. Now let's turn to Saška.
Another be late.
So this is sort of AI at work in the Montbriand building. It depends on whether it's sunny or shady, and hopefully they can bring the shades back down and keep them down. Apologies for that. Saška, we're going to turn over to you. Saška is a scientist heading up the AI foundations at IBM Research, also co-director of IBM Science for Social Good, and an IBM Fellow. She is a fellow of IEEE as well, and a member of the IBM Academy for Technology, also an author of some 100 publications, if I understand correctly, and holds no less than 16 patents. Wow. Saška, can you tell us what inclusive AI means to you?
Right. So, hello everyone, and thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure. So when I thought about this question and about a panel, and I thought actually there's many things that really mean inclusive AI, and they're all very important. But I decided to focus on 2 that are kind of directly related to the job that I do, actually 2 jobs that I have at IBM Research. So the first one is I lead our Artificial Intelligence Foundation department, which is basically a very theoretical place where people, scientists, try to kind of push the frontiers of artificial intelligence research. So we have groups like deep learning and machine learning and reinforcement learning. But one of the areas where we put a lot of effort and energy is this notion of algorithmic fairness and fairness in AI systems. And the reason is, I'm pretty sure you've read about it. It's all over the place in the news, and rightfully so, and sometimes maybe a little bit more with the PR spin on it. But whether we want it or not, we live in a world that is prejudiced and biased. I think there are about 180 biases that are cataloged, human biases that are cataloged. And as we collect the data to train our systems, or as we put that data into our AI system, these biases get propagated, and needless to say, with very broad usage of AI, they get scaled like never before. So one of the areas that we do really a fundamental work is really trying to understand how we can use science and algorithms and engineering principles to essentially keep the biases out of AI. And that involves many things, from learning how to detect biases in the data, to being able to detect biases that are maybe introduced by the models and algorithms, detecting biases in black box models such as APIs, all the way to teaching AI how to be explainable and transparent. And I believe just as AI is in its infancy, this area is still in its infancy. There is enormous potential. I really look forward to seeing more of that in practice. The other aspect that I wanted to talk about is really the ability to make AI, the benefits of AI, available to everyone and to all kinds of problems, especially humanitarian problems, not just big revenue-making products and services. So one of the things that my team tried to do in this aspect is 3 years ago, we started a program called Science for Social Good, where we partner with NGOs and public sector agencies and social enterprises, and we try to understand the challenges that they're facing and the problems that they're working on, and we try to see how technology and AI specifically can help. And we try to see if we can come up with new technologies or new solutions and prototype them. And the reason we do that is obviously because it gives us an outlet to use our skills in an areas where they're very badly needed, but also because the skill gap between the companies like IBM and Microsoft and Google, the companies who can afford very expensive AI researchers, and NGOs and other organizations that need them, the skill gap is huge. So this program is one of our ways to essentially illuminate the world about it and to tell the world about, hey, there are so many opportunities, there are so many ways that we could use AI in addition to creating consumer goods and products. Much more important than that, and kind of letting people know that this is something that we should be thinking moving forward. So I look forward to discussing it more with all of you on the panel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Saška. And I know Rebeca will pick up a little bit more on some of the humanitarian issues that they are addressing at UNHCR when we come to her. Before I turn to Eleanor, I've just been informed that the Pigeonhole app does work. So if you have a question and you were using it in the previous session, you can send in your question to Pigeonhole, and you don't have to specify your name if you don't want to. And you can also, if you're following remotely, as we said, send it in on the remote participation interface as well. So now we're going to go over to Eleanore Pauwels. Eleanor is a research fellow in emerging cyber technologies. She is with the UN Office of the United Nations University. Prior to taking up that position, she was the director of anticipatory intelligence at the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She is also a writer and an international science policy expert who specializes in the governance and democratization of artificial intelligence and converging technologies. Eleanor, we're happy to have you with us. If you could share with us how you think we can start building a local, democratized AI innovation ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Doreen. Thank you for this exceptional meeting. So let me start with a brief diagnosis, maybe, and trying to kind of unveil the nature and scope of the exclusions we could be facing in an AI-driven global economy. So the confluence of AI, biology, and neurosciences is giving rise to algorithms that can successfully analyze us, nudge us, and communicate with us. And so far beyond automation, AI will usher a new form of pervasive and affective computing, which promises to augment all the ways we behave, all the ways we function, we interact, and we create value. It goes far beyond automation. Some envision that ubiquitous computation as a way to optimize our economies towards sustainability. Others anticipate the exclusion of existing and new minorities. And those are the ones that will be excluded by biases that are baked into data optimization processes, or those who cannot acquire over life the skills and creativity that can add value to computation. So almost everybody agrees that we are facing significant uncertainties of velocity and scale that could complexify dynamics of governance between the tech makers and the tech takers, countries that are making this technology and those who are recipient of it. So AI might create immense value in Silicon Valley and Shenzhen, but might challenge the economies of countries that are relying on low-cost manufacturing. Locked in this competition race, the rising tech platforms might not see the incentives to optimize for public good, share benefits, and mitigate complex social externalities. So these dynamics of exclusion could affect not only which groups and which nations drive the design and deployment of AI, but also who gets to anticipate its global long-term implications. And you see on this slide a map that shows an assessment of the distribution of global AI talent. So we need a collective questioning about how power asymmetries are shaping AI innovation and what diversity of views exists globally. And this sounds impossible at first, yet it could be different. I'm going to show you now, it's a map of what we call fab labs, fabrication labs. They are collective spaces, community labs where you can work on different converging technologies and produce or invent anything you want. So AI could become a form of democratized computation if we create hybrid ecosystems where the creativity and knowledge of citizens in different countries can be augmented by computation, can be augmented by virtual intelligence. And a year ago, in a citizen science lab, I met a young girl from Mexico who learned, with the help of her mentor, she learned how to use AI software to recognize specific proteins that stick together to create a biopatch that could be a treatment for her brothers. He has a disease with lung. And so she came up with the concept and she came up with learning how to use those tools for that treatment. So she's 15, she's curious, and she has already acquired the most important skills for the future, which are the drive and the creativity to make AI work for our own biology. Now picture with me a scenario that we hope to implement with colleagues at MIT Media Lab and beyond. I've been working with MIT Media Lab for years. And I say scenario, but the main concept behind that reality is actually coming close to concretization under the impulse of AI and under the impulse of AI and tech convergence. So imagine this. It is 2025, and with the help of many open AI companies, citizen science lab or fab labs have become a prototype for inclusive AI innovation in many industries all over the world. You remember the previous map? They are basically covering a lot of countries. So these community labs have fostered among diverse social classes, in each person, old and young, innovators or refugees, the capacity to learn about how to harness pervasive and effective computing to address complex socio-technical challenges, but also build the skills for the future. So you have the pioneer, exploring new frontier technologies and ways of harnessing data. You have the maker, the one that uses AI for intelligent design. You have the hacker, the one that breaks AI systems to democratize the next models, and the networker, the one that anticipates the implications of connecting biological and virtual intelligence. Some will become cybersecurity analysts, some AI-assisted surgeons, others will decode our genomes for good. So they are all socially responsible actors who use AI and biology to understand themselves, but also to play a critical role in protecting social well-being and ecosystems. So they will invent and fabricate with bits, atoms, and life the next tools of our sustainable future. So my question is around this idea of what if our cities could be globally connected, but locally inventive and inspired by a diversity of knowledge and vision. And if you just give me 1 minute to end with this, I've been looking at what AI systems do very well, and it's what we call diagnosis. It comes from the Greek for knowing apart, and those algorithms will only become better at that kind of knowing apart. But knowing in all its dimensions goes far beyond computation. And in terms of sustainability, the ultimate reward is probably to learn to know together.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eleanor. Now we're going to turn to Rebeca Moreno Jimenez, who's a data scientist. We need more of them today. I think you're our only data scientist on the panel. Rebeca is from UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency, and she's working in the Innovation Service. She has supported several UNHCR field operations from Latin America to Europe to East Africa. And to the MENA countries as well. And she's been focusing on the potential of data science, artificial intelligence, and big data uses for enhanced protection and decision making. So Rebeca, can you tell us why the human-centered design approach is important in the implementation of artificial intelligence-based projects? And if you could also tell us how UNHCR is applying them in AI-based projects, and maybe give some concrete examples, please.
Thank you, Lorena, and thank you for the invitation, for inviting the High Commissioner for Refugees Agency to speak about the potential applications and how AI can be socially inclusive. I'm going to talk about precisely our mandate, and it all relies on our mandate. Our mandate is to protect people, those who are forcibly displaced and those without nationality. And with that in mind, our mandate relies on people, and anything that has to be implementing artificial intelligence projects has to have people at its center and people behind whatever rules we're applying to it. And in said that, there's many applications in the humanitarian sector. I mean, for example, there are countries like the US and Switzerland trying to explore the potentials of maybe doing resettlement based on AI. Or inclusion in general is because it's very, very complex. It's a very multidisciplinary issue. And in the agency, for example, for us, inclusion means a refugee that is newly arrived into a community and that needs to be included, I don't know, maybe doesn't speak the language, and that relies a lot of human processes for that refugee or that girl that just newly arrived to become part of that community. Also, inclusion can be in the terms of digital identity. Just the fact that a refugee has an identity in general can avoid, for example, having detention. So that's also another way of seeing inclusion. Inclusion could be a person that is displaced that actually has been forced to flee because of their gender. And so they have been persecuted for being from the LGBTI community. And so inclusion also means recognizing the freedom of choice to have their gender. So because of that, the inclusion meaning for us is so big. You need to have that at the center, the human-centered design approach. And what does it mean for us specifically? Well, I mean, one concrete example, you have some examples, that we did, it was back in 2016, and this is back then when was the Mediterranean refugee crisis. We were overwhelmed by the amount of displacement, especially in Europe. I mean, you saw it in the news as well. And what happened is that we wanted to find a movement, intentions for fleeing, and I have to say that the UNHCR Innovation Service, especially the data science team, which is me and Sophia and a lot of the people here on the team here, we're obsessed with movement. This is something that we're trying to tackle, and we're doing research about it. And we started trying to find movement, maybe intentions for moving for persons of concern in social media, to see if they were saying something about, again, their intention to flee. And what we discovered, and this is something that we had help, thank you so much. So UN Global Pulse, actually, which is speaking in the other contiguous panel, help us with research and resources. And this started as part of the Winter Cell, and my boss was leading, Chris Arney over there was leading the Winter Cell research to try to tackle movement during the winter. What happened? We didn't find movement, or at least in the data sources that we were looking, and we're very like acknowledging failure, and we wrote a paper about why we didn't find movement. Maybe it's not the preferred channel of communication. Maybe people don't want to share that they're moving for any other given reason. But what we did find was a very interesting correlation between the terrorist incidents that happened during the year 2016 and 17 and the public opinion of refugees in different languages. So we analyzed approximately, what you saw the number is 353 million tweets. In this case, publicly available data on the public API of Twitter, and the importance of public open data. And we went to find a specific what were the host communities talking about them, and refugees themselves, if they have some opinion about the host communities. And we saw a correlation, a spike on any incident, terrorist attack, the amount, so if you want to change to the training part, the amount of tweets or opinion from either the general public or maybe host communities, assumption that maybe someone tweeting in German doesn't belong to the German host community, but maybe they do. So that's an assumption that you need to underline. So in that case, we train the machine, and I want you to see this is a commercial software, but we have used text classification that we have built on our own with only Python and R to do text classifying. So that's a training data set, and we categorize in blame refugees, people that were actually saying, is the refugee fault, non-blame refugees, and then if you pass to the Berlin, so these are tweets that are trained by the machine on its own. So we put the rules, the human rules, and we put our own human rights-based approach, which is what is the definition for the High Commissioner of Human Rights on xenophobia. And the machine didn't work. We needed to refine it a lot because the machine was crazy, finding things that were not related. And we found the results. I don't know if you want to go to the presentation. It's a very, very alarming narrative that I want to share with you right now. It's a narrative that is based in two concepts, if you want to change to presentation. And the concept is fear and protection. And it's really funny because fear and protection are exactly what is in the 1951 Convention for Refugees. We are protecting, and the definition of refugees, those people with a well-founded fear of persecution for many reasons, political opinion, race, religion, anything belonging to a certain group. And because of that, our mandate is to protect them and to make them the space. Funny that we find in Twitter the narrative of some of the general public, some narrative actually fostered also, but some media, not all the media, is a fear of refugees perpetuating the attacks, which most probably refugees are the ones fleeing from the attackers, which are terrorists and people that are making civil unrest, and that governments and maybe some coast communities need to protect themselves from them and to raise borders and close the borders to them. So that's something that we found thanks to AI, and that's one of the many applications that we can do. Yeah. I think maybe just allow me 1 minute to talk to the other project, and this is just on design. It's just very, very quickly. We are also, in our application is human resources and trying to find the best and the brightest candidates. Why? Because the overwhelming, the challenge that we have in the agency is that 65 million people are forcibly displaced. 40 million are internally displaced within the borders, 23 plus are in crossing borders. So the amount of needs, protection needs, child protection, SUV areas, anything that is related to the needs as a human, logistics, camp management, water, and sanitation, it's overwhelming. And we need people to fill those gaps, people that are experts on these topics, people that are exposed to the local languages, and people that are ready to be able to serve in an emergency 72 hours deployment. So the human resources team talked to us. We couldn't find, we've explored many commercial softwares, but the rules for them to hire someone, for example, for child protection, is very, very strict. So you cannot use commercial software to compare the words that they're looking in their profiles. So we need to build our own solution. So I wanted just to show you two different solutions. One that is based on a commercial, maybe like company software, one that we need to build on our own because of the specific needs that refugee has. But just to know some of the applications of AI in our sector, to select them.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebeca, and we'll come back to you with some follow-up questions on that great work that you're doing at UNHCR. Just to remind everyone, you can send in your questions, as I mentioned before, on Pigeonhole. After we hear from Mohan Tay, we're going to open up to questions. So now, Mohan Tay, over to you. Mohan Tay is a researcher and biotechnology and bioengineering PhD student at EPFL. He has been working on diversity problems of applied machine learning. He also co-founded CrowdAI. I think you're going to tell us a little bit about that. It's a platform, as I understand it, for organizing machine learning challenges on problems in an open science way using open data. So Mohanty, we've heard from some of our other panelists their views about bias. Why don't you tell us your views about bias and how bad it is, please.
Check. Perfect. So thanks, Doreen. I will be particularly focusing on just the notion of bias in AI because we keep hearing this bias in AI in passive discussions, in media, in many other discussions. So, but what we commonly hear is bias is bad, and it always ends with a question mark or in many cases an exclamation mark. But it's actually not as simple as that. In fact, the statement bias is bad is a very oversimplified account of a very complex phenomenon that we are dealing with. Each one of you here in this single room are kind of biased because of some shared ideologies or a shared, it's not working, shared cultural context, or just part of being human. In fact, if you look at, just a second, this clicker is not quite working. Okay. So back to the presentation. So in fact, if you look at this nice infographic, all the entries that you see at the circumference of the circle are some kind of bias that each one of you have subconsciously, which you do not even realize. And it's actually very well studied, which brings us, which brings us to more common ways to actually seeing these biases in all our collective collective knowledge that is kind of captured by these large search engines like Google, where you basically use Google autocomplete to somehow basically see what kind of bias is kind of present across all us humans, or some other examples like that. Or a very common one that all of us actually live in our digital life is the filter bubble of our social media channels, where all of us are so happy of how our Twitter feed always has content which is so relevant to our own work and something that we find interesting. But that is kind of a bias that is imposed on us by the social media platforms. So to go back to the war against bias, which we read about a lot, here are some examples where The Guardian reported that how white engineers built racist code, which is dangerous for black people. And the clicker is not being friendly. This was another example where something by Google, which was trained to classify images, would classify certain people of certain ethnic races as gorillas, which was actually funnily fixed by simply removing the class of gorillas. All right, can we have the clicker fixed? Yeah, I think it's better if I move a little bit. Okay. Sorry. Okay. All right. So again, this was one example where the classifier basically started capturing this bias that was represented in these facial data sets, which basically Google fixed by completely removing the class of gorillas. Another interesting study basically shows the example of many faces of parliamentarians all around the world, and how many facial data sets wouldn't actually work on different skin tones and different racial ethnicities. And this researcher basically showed that all the general classifiers or face detectors would work the best for white males and not really that well for darker females. Then when you see that these approaches are being used for, in quotes, to make sentences to decide on parole, which have huge impacts, then you are kind of forced to ask, then you're kind of forced to ask about the implications of bias in general and how bad can it get. So, which we basically formulate as when the creator is flawed, we accept that we have so many biases and we kind of understand them academically, then how can the creation be perfect? So, going back to the traditional ways in which these machine learning models work, traditionally we used a lot of mathematical models. Then we moved to hybrid models, which simply would a mix of mathematical model and some data. Then we moved to data-driven models, which basically had a much better understanding, where they would simply represent the distribution in the data itself. Like, for example, in these case, these notion of pictures were generated by an image just by looking at the data. So they were also in some way capturing the bias in the data set to begin with. So where is this bias? It's actually everywhere. So how can we address something like this? So we have to start by first acknowledging the existence of bias. Then we have to clearly define the scope of bias and also do some more informed reporting in general in the media. For example, we should not sell a chisel as a toothpick. To give you an example, this is something that we developed for our own research where we wanted to capture the nutritional intake of populations at scale by making it easy for you to track your own food consumption. And this worked really well for some food images that we actually use. But if I sell it as a general thing which understands everything, it does not really work well if I basically put in my images in there, and then the classifier completely goes crazy and starts giving food predictions. And so this could again be misreported by the media in general as racist AI calls a religious Indian man as a beef meatloaf Brunsli. But that is something which is important when we are designing these tools. It should be very important for the creators of these tools to clearly define the scope. Then we go to making it accountable. Interpretable models is an important challenge that we are struggling with in academia. And for example, if this is actually more relevant for my own research where I have to come up with models which give diagnosis about these diseases. If I say this MRI basically has breast cancer and you come and ask why, and I go like, I don't know, this model said, that's not really going to work or instill a lot of confidence in these models and their acceptability in the society. Then finally, another important part is to fight these biases. The most important part is to empower everyone to fight these biases. So for that, we actually had started CrowdAI, which is a platform where we involve everyone all around the world in designing these AI models themselves, helping create these data sets, inferring results from them. In fact, coincidentally, we have Lucas, who is one of our active community members who brought together 600 people all around the world to teach a simulated skeleton how to walk. So, and then finally, we have to also ensure that everyone is well represented in this fight, which is a much harder problem. And all these problems are not really technological problems. They are actually majorly cultural challenges which we have to address, and we have to find answers to many of these problems for which we do not have any solutions yet. And good policies and more informed participation is probably an answer to that. Thanks. All right. So.
Thank you very much, Mohan Tay. So very complicated. Thank you for laying that all out for us. And afterwards, I'm going to come back to you so you can tell us how we can fix it. Yeah. So we did have some questions that came in through Pigeonhole, but maybe first in the room, if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question. Otherwise, we will take the questions that are on the screen. Okay, so we can take the questions on the screen. So we have 3 questions that are being asked. The first is, what role can policymakers play in ensuring inclusion? The second question, we have heard that AI exacerbates exclusion. Can it also help foster inclusion? And then the third question, on what kinds of incentives can we create to promote inclusion? So with those 3 questions in mind, who would like to go first?
Okay, I can give it a try.
Yeah, Saška, go ahead.
What role can policymakers play in ensuring inclusion? That's an interesting one because I think there are already areas in industries that are regulated and where inclusion in a way is already placed into the books. Like, for example, in the United States, you cannot offer insurance or credit score or rating or decision that is based on gender, race, and many other protected attributes. They're similar in housing, similar in workforce, like job discrimination. So some of these things were already there because of the previous technologies, but I think what is incredibly important as we start using more and more decision support in our lives is that we kind of understand what are the additional implications and what are the kinds of things that we should or should not be regulating. So obviously regulation is one way to help a lot. However, having said that, that's only one way because there are many others. Right now, in the places and applications that are not regulated, we kind of rely entirely on a developer of an AI system to be aware of what inclusion means, what bias means, what fairness means. And it's a hard thing to do. It requires subject matter expertise. It requires sometimes being able to visualize what are all kinds of bad things that can happen because of an unknown product or an unknown thing that someone is putting on the market. So as we keep on developing more of AI, I think there is going to be an increasing number of new mechanisms that we are going to be putting in order to foster inclusion. First of all, I believe that the inclusive AIs or bias checkers, fairness, service checkers will become a part of development toolkit. So the developers are not the ones who are solely responsible, but that they have a tools and platform that support these kinds of tasks. We're also seeing new business models that are coming. We're seeing auditing agencies that are showing up or consulting firms that are showing up that are beginning to actually either certify or check the algorithms for inclusion or fairness and biases, or are advising their clients of what it means to be inclusive. This is a completely new thing. We've never seen that before. And I also believe that there is going to be something that can equate to a marketplace of service certification. As developers put new APIs into the tools or on the marketplace, it is conceivable to think, just as we have an application marketplace in Apple Store, you go and you give 5-star to an app, it is conceivable that we'll be also fairness checking the apps that are out there, but by third-party developers. So I think the point is this is a completely new world that we are in, and it's a personal belief. I think it's going to be a balance of all these factors that is kind of going to be responsible for ensuring fairness in a long run moving forward, because it's a completely new territory, and to some extent it's still an uncharted territory for us.
I was just going to say, like with EY and my background being a tech advisor as well as an auditor, I actually just on Friday had a half-day conversation with a number of my practitioners to talk about how we can provide as a firm that third-party independent assessments and assurance. But we recognized that with the development of AI and the technology, us coming in at the back end of the technology development is going to be very counterproductive. And so we really need to be there at the design table to be talking about how do you build in ethical design into the development? How do you make sure you've got the right people at the design table? How do you have as a governance structure, whether it's an ethical advisory board or if it's a set of ethical standards that are being applied, and making sure that there's that awareness. And I think that's, as you know, having been in this technology risk space for 20 years, I'm really happy to see that this early in the stage of a technology, we're having this conversation, because I've been around with other technologies and these conversations weren't happening at this early of a stage of a technology. And so I think that is a sign that there is this societal agreement, if you call it, or consciousness that we do want to develop this technology in a socially inclusive and transparent and trusted manner. I think it's just important that we all, in our respective roles in, you know, whatever this development cycle is, that we put on this this responsibility. I've been doing a lot of studying on ethics, and I'm concerned about the form of ethics called separatism, which I can separate my role as being that I just take orders and someone else is making the ethical and moral decision. And I think we can't afford for AI to be developed in that fashion. As any technology, whether we're talking blockchain, Internet of Things, big data, they're all interconnected. And I think that we all need to kind of take on that responsibility.
Okay, Eleanor?
Yeah, so I'm going to try to tease out this notion of to foster inclusion and kind of reinforce some of what Rebeca has been saying. So I think we need to kind of do a paradigm shift from being too reductionist. We kind of need to avoid reductionism and favor a diversity of knowledge, experiences, and values. And we have to do that for different kind of technologies. I had kind of gathered a few examples of AI applications that have been developed recently that really need what we call that form of tacit knowledge or experiential knowledge, or what different groups, in society go through as they live. And for example, how can you design and improve an AI application which offers psychological support to Syrian refugees or soldiers with PTSD if you don't integrate their own experiential knowledge of what life and conflict means? How can you develop an AI application that recognizes specific viruses attacking plants if you don't integrate the knowledge of people who have grown those plants for decades and have been part of the ecosystem and maybe are aware of other threats? Same with this app we saw this morning about remote cervix cancer screening. How can you make such an app actually beneficial if you don't know what the cultural or medical practices at play in a specific context or society? What are those specific practices? So there is really this notion of what are we trying to include in socially inclusive AI? And part of it is that form of experiential and tacit knowledge. And that means that we need for that to have what I call community lab interventions. So collective spaces where the enterprise is not driven by the bottom line and the benefits, but it's actually really a collective space where you can have end users, citizens, first of all, young women. I mean, really a lab scale intervention where you mix this granular notion of what the biases are with other forms of knowledge.
I think maybe because we're humanitarians, we see it differently. I think the problem for us is inclusion, and then AI is a tool, and you manipulate the tool to achieve inclusion. No? And so a lot of the conversations that you're doing is about, if it's ethical, I understand who's at the design of the project. What we do is we go and ask refugees themselves if they think this is fair or not to be applicable, or if they think this can help them or not. And if they think there's not applicable or the tool doesn't fit the nail, then we change the tool. And we can use or not AI, right, in some of the problems that we're talking, especially in the inclusion matter. Something that's important, I think that I want to just put it out there, which is our bread and butter in the refugee, like UNHCR Innovation and Refugee Agency in general, is that a lot of our contexts where we work don't have electricity or don't have connectivity. So we sometimes cannot apply AI to all of the problems that we have. Certainly, there are certain issues that we can actually tackle, or, for example, data, which is huge, it's increasing, and it's something that a lot of the organizations are working on. And that's a very concrete application of AI in a lot of the organizations. Certainly is one of many. No? I think AI can help you foster inclusion if you take into consideration, and I guess I really echo you on the culture part. So in our context, because we work in 100 plus different countries with so many different languages, you need to adapt to the context, you need to adapt to the human rules, to anything that is on the local context, and then you start mainstreaming from there, because that's how inclusion looks like in different scenarios. And the cultural aspect is the most important. For that, I guess organizations need to have strong policies or code of conduct or guidelines on what it means for them to have inclusion, diversity, and how AI can help you achieve that goal as an organization, right? And that's how they foster, or if AI is one of the tools or not, right? So I think that's, if we see the problem in a different lens, that's when you find really helpful. I think I want to try to respond to the one vote over there. And that's one of the things that you can do with AI.
Thank you. So Mohan Tay, I'm going to go over to you, but I would also like, when you respond, if you can also pick up the question that has come in about should we just leave it to techies and tech companies?
I was anyway about to answer that. So again, the notion of AI, as has been practiced both in academia and industry right now in our day-to-day usage, basically started as something on the whiteboard of a researcher. Then now it has pretty much moved into the workshop of an engineer, and maybe in a few years it will actually move onto your work desk. And it's actually something which is not very far-fetched. If you think about most of the things you do with, say, something really like Excel or spreadsheets in general, that used to be kind of a speciality which you had to learn by spending years of understanding a tool. And now you just take it for granted and you use it as a part of your everyday life. And in general, in this whole cycle, we have a lot to learn from the whole open source culture and everything that they went through in the last 20 years. Open source software basically has contributors from all walks of life, students, engineers, activists, everyone. And what they basically contribute and help build together is pretty complicated to begin with. But everyone starts with just one small baby step, and the community makes this baby step very easy to take and makes the whole product much more accessible for everyone, for the general good. The same in AI actually. At CrowdAI, that is our mission to convince everyone that each one of you can contribute a lot to AI, and in many cases just because of how this whole thing is packaged as a large complicated piece of black box which we can never understand and should only be left to researchers, many just shy away to even try. But at the end of it, if you spend a few hours, certainly it's a new skill you have picked up, and then when you basically look at a new say AI solution that someone is selling to you, you basically see its shortcoming from your own cultural context, and then if the whole thing is open source, you can also contribute back and help together build something which is more acceptable for everyone in general and solves your own problem. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to my panelist for a second round of questions, and maybe Cathy, over to you, and also picking up on the question about incentives, specific incentives. So kind of from the EY perspective and some of the programs that you have done on diversity, maybe you could share some of the examples and the incentives.
Yeah, I'm kind of been mulling on that question about incentives, because underlying that is a question as to who is responsible for inclusiveness. And reading the question, I'm thinking the orientation is how do we incent the technology companies, the developers to be focusing on inclusiveness. And I would shift the question and think about it more from a broader perspective as to how can we include everyone in the benefits of AI, and then back into then how we have them participate. And I think through, just as I was this past week, we had a number of technology companies do developer conferences, and they were showcasing a number of their different technologies and the different applications that they're working on. And as I was thinking about this conference, I was thinking about, from a Canadian perspective, I could see utility in a lot of what they were developing. But if I was, from a developing country, would a lot of this have practical application to me? And so thinking about then, how do we then incent the technology companies to be partnering with, almost like saying I have a conference that is showcased here in Silicon Valley or another developing area, and I also have a sister group that's in one of the developing countries. And when I have a technology such as a virtual assistant, I'm showing about how you could use it in the developed world, and I'm showing how that same technology, the base of it, can be used in the developing world. And I think that will happen when we, who are currently the consumers of a lot of this technology, raise our voices and say, I want you to do this differently. Because if I think about one of the things that happened last week, is that there was a virtual assistant demo around an AI calling and making hair appointment. And very quickly, there was a lot of criticisms that it never announced that it was a machine. And so the developers got a lot of questions. They got a lot of media questions. They got a lot of tweets of people saying, look, I want it to be announced to me that this is a machine. And so the developers were like, yes, we'll build that in then. We have heard you. We know this is what you want. And so I think that's more so than incenting. I think you probably have a better voice as a consumer, as a participatory individual in this technology build, to raise your voice and say, this is what I want. I want there to be this technology being developed for me as well. I want to see how you're developing it for someone else. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is, in kind of from a diversity, taking on a bit of a different angle, but one of the programs that we're doing that I'm actually really quite proud of is that back in 2016, we recognized that diversity has a lot of different dimensions, and one of them is neural the way we think differently. And so we actually started a pilot program to invite people into the EY family on the autism spectrum. With the move to AI and technology, data is a very big underlying piece of that, and people with autism think in a way that is very data-orientated, very strongly analytical. They're very good at routine processing, and so we did a pilot to bring them in and have them work with us. And what we found was that they were very successful. We developed their particular jobs and their activities that would really bring up their unique skill sets. But what we learned as well is that we had to actually also accommodate for them. That we it wasn't just a function of giving them a computer and a desk and a job title. We had to also think about that we were accommodating and including them by thinking about our working styles. So, most of us now within EY have hoteling. Well, that kind of coming in each day, not knowing where you're going to be sitting would be something very anxious to someone on the autism spectrum. And so we had to accommodate to make sure that they had a very consistent working environment. The communication styles that everyone had and working with them had to change. And so that also has to be a part of inclusiveness, is that it's not just inviting them to the table, but basically changing the table to accommodate for them as well.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Saška, picking up a little bit on the incentive part, but also the point about is there light at the end of the tunnel? And I was thinking about our discussion before about business models. Do we need new business and partnership models?
Right. I think that is a really, really huge question, because I'm a big believer in technology in the sense that I believe that when we put our heads to a problem, we know how to solve it with technology, right? We know how to create a solution. And so, for example, in our program, we built a hate speech lexicon. We built a prototype of an AI advisor that can help low-income individuals, give them advice to stay out of poverty. So we kind of know how to do certain things. But on the other hand, developing these kinds of solutions it's a very, very expensive thing. From creating a prototype, to testing the prototype, to putting it out in the field to make sure it works, to scaling it, to supporting it. There are actually very few organizations in this world that can afford these kinds of things. Just to give you an idea, if you want to develop a product or a solution, and if you're a big company, say you're Google, and you want to develop a duplex, or if you're an IBM and you want to develop a new server, or you're an Amazon and you want to develop new Alexa, or even if you're Johnson & Johnson and you want to make a new shampoo, right? There are three things that you need. You need funding for your product. You need expertise in the area that you want to develop a product in, and you need the skills to do that, right? You need to have money, you need to know something about hair shampoos, and you need to have your chemists develop the formula. So if you're Johnson & Johnson, it's very simple, it's easy, you have them all in-house. If you're IBM, it's simple and easy, you have it all in-house. Now imagine developing a solution that addresses a big humanitarian problem, or a problem in the developing country. What happens is that the skills to do it are typically really in very few places. The funding to do it is someplace else. It's in a private foundation or maybe the government levels, and often there is not enough. And then the problem, the subject matter expertise is with NGOs. It's with the people and organizations that are really sitting at the forefronts and battling these problems. And we don't know how to triangulate these issues. Today, we don't have business models that put these three things together in the same way that they are together when a big company develops a new product. And until we find a model that will work for all of them, it's going to be really hard. And that's something that actually worries me a lot, because this gap and the technology gap and the skill gap is just growing, and the AI skills are more and more expensive. And I think we're kind of banking on this thing that AI will be democratized at one point and it'll be accessible to everyone. But I'm not quite sure that it's going to happen anytime soon. So we gotta be looking into a new game in this space that will get these kinds of solutions out there faster.
Great, thank you.
I can just
Yeah.
respond quickly. I completely agree with you, and I know one of the things that EY's been doing the last couple of years is, as a professional services firm, we have individuals with deep specialization across a whole spectrum of skills, and so what we've been starting to do is working with some of those local social or industry groups in the developing countries, and on a non-for-profit basis, basically giving access to their folks. And a lot of them is not yet about fixing the technology, because the organizations just don't even have the management skills. They don't have the human resources skills. They don't have the financial skills. And so, the technology would be the easy part for them. But, the problem is if you put in just a technology and you don't have all those other management skills, at best it's going to be ineffective, but at worst it's going to outright fail. And so we've been starting to work with those organizations to deal with some of the productivity issues that were discussed earlier today, which is, it's more than just a deficit of technology skills. There's a lot of different knowledge and skills that also need to be addressed at the same time, and that's where I think, I was thinking about that incentive question as well. The other thing that some developing countries can do is do almost like a pay-to-play type of model, because data is so it's such a huge fundamental requirement right now. And right now, a lot of countries and individuals, as they start to get onto mobile and phones, their data is just being consumed into the broader data model. But is there a way to basically have organizations say, look, okay, we're going to allow you to now play within our market, but for that we expect that you're going to create the technology institutions, you're going to create the management centers, you're going to create the local jobs to kind of stimulate and bring up our whole economies. And I think that's something we need to be kind of pushing more at the policy level and at the government level as well.
Good. Okay. So, Eleanor, over to you. Saška was mentioning the point about democratization. Maybe if you want to jump in there and share with us your views about what are the preconditions to actually get there.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking, we talk about that table where to invite people to talk or voice their concerns. I think that table doesn't exist most of the time, and that's a problem. So we need to rethink what kind of collective space can be used for voicing those concerns, for integrating different forms of knowledge. And that's why I was trying to kind of, describe these labs, because I've worked with them for a long time, but those labs, Fab Labs, Citizen Science Lab, can be working on different technologies, can integrate some of them, but at least it's a space where you actually create, invent, develop skills, and develop and integrate a specific kind of knowledge that you need for solving problems that are more local or that are new, or just to, you use creativity. And we keep talking about a gap of skills, but why not tackle it by actually letting citizens have access to global data commons, civic trust? You can have different legal forms for those shared data repositories, but a way that you could actually turn your own data, your own ideas, your own design into innovations. The design imagined by one company might not be what we need and what we want. And so you need those global data commons, but you need also kind of a collective commitment to include that experiential knowledge, that tacit knowledge. And for that, I've seen in Yucatan, in Kumasi, in all parts of the world, I've seen people inventing new design and using either biology or AI to do so. So how do we foster that? How do we empower that? And that means funding, but that means also mentorship. Why can we get, why can we create Fab Fellowship or Citizen Science Fellowship where people from industry, AI talent can visit some of those labs sometimes in their life, in their career, and help redistribute some of their learning, some of their skills. I mean, that could be an interesting model to democratize not only the tech, but the knowledge and the mentorship.
And Rebeca, over to you on the UNHCR side, in terms of challenges and kind of the partnership model that you have in place. What are the kinds of challenges you've been facing, and what are the ways we can overcome them and scale some of the solutions that you've come up with?
Of course. Okay, so, there's mainly I try to summarize, I guess the challenges are mainly 5. on the application of AI. There are many, but I think I can collect at least 5. One is the issues of representativeness, and yet again, we work in very different various places, and sometimes AI or data that is embedded into the AI applications are coming only, for example, for data sources that are, say, social media. So representativeness of people posting social media is only representative of those who has access to internet and or are able to tweet in a certain language that the machine can recognize. I mean, there's many groups, especially, for example, Eleonore Pauwels is building an application that actually recognizes Somali in radio, which is something that you don't find very frequently in some of our commercial type of tools that we have, or Rohingya, or Burmese and Rohingya, right? So that's something that needs to work on it. The second one, I think it was mentioned already, but just to see how bias is applicable to the humanitarian cause. So bias can come from humans and from the machines, and from humans training the machines. Humans, for example, in the human resources project that I mentioned, is humans that are selecting people to work in a certain company or organization have their own bias to select. Some of the people that we have interviewed, because we have been working with the design, with the human resources team, and people that have worked for many years trying to get the best and the brightest to work in the most remote and inhospitable places in the world. They tell us, well, I look at these, and these. But I was asking, so you look on a very good cover letter, right? Yeah, and that most probably is written in one of the UN languages, right? Yeah, so you're biased to those people that have Western education or UN common language on that, and so for them to be able to recognize their bias, that's something that is remarkable. Also, if you're training the machines can help you in general to overcome that bias. For example, if you're looking, and I think I'm trying to respond to some of the question, for certain profile, say in IT, or logistics, fleet management, or security, which are kind of like male sectors in the humanitarian sectors, you can tell the machine, find me from this pile of candidates, like 90% are going to be male, find me the best women. And you can do positive bias to the machine to do that. I think the third one is the context. We find that with the xenophobia thing, so at some point the machine found slang. So there were certain words of how they were referring to refugees in slang, and they were using, for example, the hashtag with refugees to say, oh yeah, you know, the policies with refugees is making us that. So that's a sarcasm that the machine would think is actually a positive comment, which is actually a detrimental. Just using sarcasm as a way, so machines cannot detect that. That's very human. So also acknowledging that. I think the fourth and most, I think, very, very important also is data protection, and we are huge in the agency for data protection. We have one of the soundest data protection policies, actually mirrored to a lot to the European General Data Protection Regulation. And what we do is, because the data that is being handled by a machine, not only personal data from the organization, is data of people that could potentially be deprived of life. They are persecuted, right? They're requesting political asylum. They're fleeing from terrorists, from people that are menacing them. And so if there is a data breach and you are not able to have that ethics and that data protection, very strong data protection policy, we're criticized in the humanitarian sector for not sharing a lot of that data. We have ways of tokenize, anonymize, be partisan, do a lot of mechanisms to protect our people, because that's in our mandate again. And finally, and that's a call, I want to respond to the question, the one of the 3 votes and the 2 votes, which are the incentives. And I'm going to say it, me, my now Mexican data science women in the UN hat. The way you incentivize people to work on these issues are making them the space. And if you see the other panels out there, you're going to see while Western educated male leading the UN agencies, the organizations, you're going to see them in all the panels. And there's few spaces where women are actually being able to sit on the table and make the rules of the game. And the AIM in this case. So I think, why is Mohan Tay the only one? Well, I don't know Mohan Tay on a personal level. There's many other super talented male there in the other rooms. You can see them there. But I think the ones that were carving inclusion in the space are women. A lot of women are opening that space, carving it little by little. I mean, you see them here. They're the leads of their organizations, so that's why maybe there are not many women. The incentives just create the space for them to have an opinion, don't mansplain, and just give them the space on the table.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you for bravely taking up that question. I see a question in the back of the room. If you could introduce yourself and then state your question, and then Mohan Tay, we're going to come over to you. So please go ahead.
Yes, my name is Chris Annie.
You have to wait till it turns red.
It's on red.
There you go.
Hi. My name's Chris Ernie. I'm the head of the innovation service at UNHCR. I'm lucky enough to work with Rebe, and I was gonna call out that ridiculous question with the 3 votes there on. Sorry, is it 2 votes or 3 votes? 2 votes on Mohanty being the only male on the panel, and kind of reiterate what Rebe has said, but I don't need to. So I'm going to ask a different question, and my question was around and directly to our 2 friends from EY and IBM. I'm interested in conversations around how we can make the creation of AI more inclusive. Like, I think conversations are great. I'm also interested in the private sector, the big private sector companies having the skills, the expertise, the money, and the ability to set the tone and to set the pace at the beginning of a technology, and not waiting to pick up the pieces later on, not waiting for digital divides, not waiting for an AI divide. So I have one question to both of you, if I may, and that's what will you do leaving this conference to make sure that your respective organizations don't create such divides and are more inclusive when it comes to the creation of AI? Over to you.
Okay, good question, and we're going to come to that in a moment. So I'm going to just ask you to keep that question in mind. And before we come to that, maybe Mohan Tay, over to you on the question that I raised before about what can we do to fix the bias issue. And we heard from Eleanor some of her thoughts about the citizen labs and getting everyone involved and the fab labs, and you have your CrowdAI. Would you like to share your thoughts on that? And then we're going to come back to our private sector colleagues. Please go ahead.
Yes, sure. In fact, having a lot more people involved is kind of the answer to kind of reducing bias in general, and having proper representation from all of the different shared contexts is the answer. But I think Saška mentioned that, again, this technological democratization is a very hard problem. And again, many people are very pessimistic if it can actually happen. But I, on a personal level, I'm very optimistic that this can actually happen, because this piggybacks on this idea of what exactly do we call as technological democratization. Do we want everyone in this single room to sit down and start writing a lot of code which is AI? Or do we want a seed amount of people who have the enough skills to actually start and lead a pretty large-scale AI project? And then it's the question of the management of these large set of people with different levels of expertise. That's why I would just go back to the same example that I gave of open source software development. All these softwares are pretty complicated pieces of software which pretty much fuel much of modern day science right now. And they are managed by a small number of really skilled people, and then a large number of people who are trying to learn, but very efficiently coordinated together in a beautiful way to finally come up with a product which works. So again, as I said, it needs a small seed number of people who have enough skills, a lot of skills in managing all these people together so that all these efforts are focused in the right direction. And this is something which can happen and should happen over the few years with AI, especially given it's becoming much and much more accessible. In fact, many of you, if you have a little bit of background and someone told you that you can never actually build an AI for a problem you care about just because it's too hard, he was really lying. You can spend a few hours over a weekend and you actually get started seeing progress.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing the optimism. It's encouraging. Now back to Cathy and Saška to respond to Chris's question. Views from the private sector, and what would be the one thing you would do when you leave this room today?
Well, I myself am in a unique position because I was just appointed a couple months ago as EY's Global Trusted AI Leader. So I have a lot I can do once I leave this conference and things that I've been already doing. I see that it's really important that we show leadership in this area. I had just conversations on Friday, and there's a lot of support within our technology group that we want to walk the talk. So if we're telling our clients they should have an ethics advisory board, we're going to have one. We're going to develop ethical design standards. We're going to be at the table with the governments. We're just having a conversation just on Thursday with the PCOB, which is our regulator for our audit firm, around, as AI is starting to use in financial reporting, what is going to be our role in providing trust over its use. And I think that's the number one role that we can play is providing instilling that trust through both the advisory work that we do with our clients. And what I have seen is I've started to kind of interface across the globe with my colleagues is that as I'm getting deck after deck of the dialogue we're having with our client, and I do appreciate it's conversation at this point, but it's important to have awareness at the beginning as well, is that deck has in it what is AI, how could it be used, what are the use cases, and then this is how you have to manage the risk. This is how you build trust. And I think it is really encouraging to see that that is part of the dialogue, and that, and funny that as we speak to organizations about those different services that we have, the trusted AI dialogue that we can have is the piece that they keep asking us to come back and talk to them more about. So I think there is that recognition that is really important, and it is something that the executives at our clients, and I'm not just talking technologists, I'm talking the banks, the defense companies, the retailers, so I think that what is important is that we as a private organization, and I think also as the technologists, all work to find ways to do it in a more trusted manner, but also to be more inclusive to some of the ideas I talked about earlier about how we can try to. I think we've got some really large problems, but I think that they can be solved quite quickly if we bring our minds to it. Like usually when we decided to go to the moon, we went to the moon pretty quickly, under a decade once we really started to put, so what is our moonshot that we want to put forward, and I think that should be something by the end of this conversation on Thursday that we think about. I think that is one of the terms I saw in the program, what are going to be the moonshots. So what I would say, we need to create some focus, because if we try to spread ourselves too thin, we cannot accomplish as much. So let's create some really focused areas and what they can really move the needle. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I can maybe add a couple words. You may not realize it, but actually trust and inclusion and fairness and developing systems that people will believe in and use and feel that they're trustworthy is going to be essential for private companies, because it's really a question of not just it's the right thing to do on values, but it's like, are you going to stay in business? Because if people don't trust your products, they're not going to be buying your products. That's the end of the day. And you saw it actually. I think that the thing that happened with Google Duplex was a very interesting demonstration of that, because the Duplex was a very impressive technology demonstration, but it didn't resonate with public because they didn't bring it in the market in the way that it implied trust. They did not explain how it's going to be used, that it's a bot, a whole bunch of things. I'm not going to go into them. But the technology didn't win over the ethics. So for the private companies, ethics and building AI systems that the customers will trust is going to be a matter that will keep them in business. So what I do in my position is, for example, our large team in IBM Research actually really works on all the aspects of engineering and scientific aspects of what is it we as engineers and scientists can do to build better and more trustworthy systems. And it means from, hey, how do we mitigate biases? How do we mitigate biases algorithmically from data? I spoke about it. It involves how do you wire your systems with some sort of immutable storage or instrumentation so that later on maybe even many years on, you can reproduce the decision or you can reproduce what happened in that system because you will have to do it for a purpose of law or regulation or just to show what happened for safety reasons. We're trying to look at, hey, how do we create algorithms that are essentially explainable, or how do we make black box algorithm explainable, because this is so fundamentally important. So I think as a part of what private companies do, you actually see more and more that because it is going to make it or break it.
Okay, I know we're quite short on time, but if I wanted to come back to Eleanor and Rebeca and Mohan Tay for a last comment. Eleanor, we have spoken about many different dimensions of what it means to have socially inclusive AI. Is there anything we left out when we talk about inclusion?
I mean, something that worries me or that keeps me, that worries me, I would say, is it's really the skills gap and giving a chance for people in the future to be empowered enough they can, invent their own job, figure out how to harness data and AI for their own trajectory. I've met enough young people who could do it that it's actually possible, but how do you create that space for that form of empowerment? And so that skills gap worries me, that space for inventing, for imagining together, for doing also a more socially inclusive foresight. Like, why would it be only some layers of society being able to anticipate the implications of a technology? And how can we foster, that form of foresight early on with different imaginations, different form of knowledge, different values? So I think that's something we've not really found a way to do, and it's going to come, it's going to be important for other technologies like genome editing. If we could figure that out and maybe have a space for citizens to be not only passive but actually own a little more of their future and be able to reclaim that, I think that would really make sense. So it's much more than just a consumer service, or it's actually a space where to create. And when you see the kind of jobs we might have in the future, I think that's very key. And when I was talking about those mentorship, fellowship from engineers coming from companies, that form of redistribution, we don't have an adequate redistribution right now of the benefits that are being made through combinatorial computation to much larger layers of society. And I think that would be very cool to actually have them, visit some citizen science lab and fab labs and create a space for the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Rebeca, I don't want to put you on the spot, but there's an interesting question on effective inclusion. So NGOs knowing what kinds of questions to ask, starting with the problem they want to solve. I think if we put it in your context at UNHCR, you know what problems you want to solve versus trying to become experts in every kind of new technology. Do you want to touch on that very briefly?
For sure, no. We have many problems, and like you say, technology for us is a toolbox, yet again. So that's the reason why you don't see us talking about blockchain, because we have a data protection policy, yet again, what I was telling you. And blockchain has its implications, very brilliant solution, but maybe not applicable to context of political persecution or torture, victims of torture. So there's certain applications, certain technologies in certain cases. I think the first I need, it's a backwards called approaches. We have many challenges that we have, that since the issues of communications, of connectivity, or financials, data organization, and we have the ability of actually very well articulating them, put us in the design table. All the developers of AI, people that are working on creating those solutions or technology, we would love to give us our issues, and I think that might be very, very encouraging for you to receive audio feedback, even for refugees themselves, if you are interested in solving those issues. And also, I understand that a lot of it's corporate it's a lot of the corporate knowledge that you have, but try to be a bit more transparent as well. So I talk about the issue of representatives and bias. So if you disclose your assumptions on how did you build certain technology, how did you build a certain process, which is what we do usually in the innovation team, you need to be very transparent of, I'm assuming this, and this is this. And then the bias part, you, if possible, if not, disclose the data, if not anonymized, tokenized, partial data, whatever you mask the data for, but you could be fostering open data for us to be working on it. And also for us, we're working on having open data for you guys to work on our data sets. And finally, I think beyond open data and disclosing assumption also, if you're able, again, for copyright reasons, sometimes you can't, to disclose at least some of the rules that you use for the black boxes that exist on AI, assumptions or minimum rules, that would be very useful for us when we're training the machine to know what it's behind, for example, a text analysis classification. Why are you matching this word with this word? Otherwise, we will keep building or going for open source to build our own solutions because we cannot find specific things that are nuances to our context. Now we know our challenges very, very well.
Okay, thank you. And Mohan Tay, last point for you. How do we know when a prediction is biased and when can we trust it? If you can very briefly comment on that.
That's actually a much more complicated problem, and in fact, we are struggling with the same question in academia in general, on how do we have interpretable models. And again, I think I mentioned it in one of my slides. If I just gave you a prediction based on an MRI that this said patient has breast cancer, and I delegate the blame to the model, that's not something which will actually fly. So before we can actually trust these models, we need to have these processes in place where if we are investing a lot of our time and effort in a direction in the name of academic progress, and then we suddenly want to take this academic progress into a product, there should be processes in place which basically answer all of these questions about interpretability, trust, very much like it is another entity which has to be held accountable for itself. Without that, it's simply not safe to begin with to be actually used in practice. And if we are impatient and just because we see some good results in academia and we want to push these results really into the industry and into the real world, then this impatience might actually cost us a lot more in the long term by actually bringing down the trust the general population has in these systems.
Well done. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating our amazing panel. We are unfortunately out of time, so please join me with a round of applause for our panel. This has been an extremely rich discussion on a very complex topic, one that is, I would say, a prerequisite to really having AI for good for all. It's something that we really need to tackle and to build in from the design stage. I think lots of points to take away from the challenges around the skill gap that I think you all brought up about the challenges around bias and bias being everywhere. And I thank you, Mohan Tay, for explaining indeed how very complicated biases are. They are a reflection of the society that we live in today. The need to empower everyone to be engaged. As I mentioned, the need to be there at the design stage, at the beginning. The need to be favoring diversity, the importance of transparency, accountability, and also the point about understanding the beneficiaries, about understanding the local needs, I think is an important takeaway as well. Coming up with new business models, new partnership models, some of the challenges around funding, and the need for collective spaces. I think that's a good one, be it Fab Labs, Citizen Labs, or Crowd AI. And the importance of trust, which I think was underscored by many of you at the end, and of course walking the talk that I hope we can all do as we leave this room. And with that, I'd like you to find your way back to the plenary room. So if you found your way here, I assume you won't have any problems getting back there to the Popov room at 5:30. We will have a special guest, the Director General of the UN in Geneva, Mr. Michael Muller, and he will be joining us at 5:30 for his keynote address. Thank you very much.